Tonight, we're embarking on a captivating journey through one of history's most harrowing and transformative eras, the time of the Black Death. Get cozy, but before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe if you truly enjoy this kind of immersive storytelling. And do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see where our listeners are joining us from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan to create a gentle background hum, and let's quietly slip into the world we're about to explore together. Imagine this: you've just awakened in 1347, deep in medieval Europe. The morning air is brisk, and you stretch groggily atop a mattress stuffed with straw. You're not in a bedroom with doors and windows. You share a single room with your entire family. The cottage walls are crafted from a timber frame packed with daub and wattle, a blend of mud, straw, and clay. It may look rough, but it insulates against the cold surprisingly well. Still, the thatched roof above your head leaks during heavy rains. As you sit up, familiar scents greet your nose. The lingering smoke of last night's hearth fire, the earthy aroma of the packed dirt floor, and the unmistakable tang of unwashed bodies. Bathing isn't part of everyday life here, but it doesn't matter much. Everyone smells the same, so no one really notices. Your stomach rumbles. Maybe there's some hardened bread left from yesterday. If so, you'll likely dunk it in ale to soften it. Yes, even children drink weak ale. It's far safer than the water, which might be teeming with invisible killers if drawn from a polluted source. Outside your humble home, the village is already coming to life. You can hear the distant mooing of cattle, the clucks of chickens, and the chatter of neighbors heading to work. Most of the people here are peasants, either tenant farmers who pay rent to the local noble or serfs tied to the land, providing labor in exchange for protection and shelter. Life runs on a reliable cycle. Sunrise to sunset defines the day, church bells mark the weeks, and the seasons measure the years, shaping the patterns of planting and harvest. It's a life of toil and repetition, but it's all you've ever known. What you don't know, what no one knows yet, is that the very rhythm of this life is about to be broken. An unseen shadow is spreading across the land, more destructive than any war or famine. You first hear rumors from a passing merchant, a man who arrives with silk from the east and fragrant spices from foreign lands. But this time, he brings more than goods. He brings grim stories. He speaks of a deadly illness ravaging cities along the trade routes. Thousands are perishing, struck down by a sudden fever, grotesque swellings, and near certain death. Some in your village cross themselves and whisper prayers. Others scoff, dismissing the tales as travelers' exaggeration. After all, frightening gossip often spreads faster than reality. The merchant moves on. Life returns to normal briefly, but the rumors won't go away. In fact, they grow louder, more urgent, and more detailed. By the time autumn colors the trees, the whispers have become cries. The disease has arrived at Europe's Mediterranean ports: Messina, Marseilles, Venice. Stories speak of ships docking with no living crew, just corpses sprawled on the decks. God protect us. Your mother murmurs as she hears the news, making the sign of the cross. Villagers begin to prepare in vague, uncertain ways. Some hoard food. Others go to church more often, seeking divine shelter. The village healer gathers herbs and roots, though no one knows whether they'll help. Winter brings the first nearby casualties. A neighboring hamlet, just a few hours' walk away, reports strange deaths. High fevers, unquenchable thirst, and disturbing black lumps in armpits and groins. Most who fall ill die within 3 days. The elders gather in worry. Some advocate sealing the village from outsiders. Others argue that cutting trade will starve them faster than any disease. Ultimately, life continues, but a new current of dread flows beneath its surface. Then it happens. One frosty morning, a young mill worker doesn't show up. When someone checks on him, he's burning with fever, drenched in sweat. His neck grotesquely swollen with a lump the size of a small egg. The plague has arrived. What follows is a terror more visceral than any nightmare. The sickness spreads with horrifying speed. A person who feels fine at dawn is bedridden by dusk, and by the 3rd day they're often dead. The black, swollen lymph nodes, those dreaded buboes, give the disease its ominous name, the Black Death. They're excruciating. Some sufferers cough blood, a sign the disease has moved to the lungs. These poor souls rarely last more than a day. It's God's punishment. Some cry, flogging themselves in the streets to atone. Others blame the air, stuffing herbs into masks or carrying posies to mask the miasma. A few mutter even darker suspicions, accusing Jews of poisoning wells, though your village has no Jewish residents and the theory holds no weight. The real cause is a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, though no one in your world knows it. It hides in the guts of fleas that ride on rats. Rats that sail aboard ships and scurry through every village and city. When an infected flea bites a human, it vomits bacteria into the wound. The infection grows quickly, causing those signature swellings. If it reaches the lungs, it becomes pneumonic plague, airborne and even more lethal. But all you know is that people are dying, and no one seems able to stop it. Church bells, once a symbol of faith and timekeeping, now ring constantly for the dead, until there are too many, and the bells fall silent. Funerals vanish. Corpses are dumped into mass graves. In some homes, the dead lie unburied for days until someone finds the courage to drag them away. Fear changes everything. Healthy families shut their doors to everyone. The sick are shunned. Some flee into the forests. Others join wild religious processions, beating themselves in desperate acts of devotion. Priests die by the dozens, victims of their sacred duty to administer last rites. Some abandon their congregations. Others stay and perish. Your family has been lucky so far. You've heard horror stories from nearby villages. Entire households gone, children orphaned and then lost, young lovers separated by sudden death. But your turn seems inevitable. One morning, your younger brother wakes feeling ill. By midday, he's feverish. By evening, you see the telltale lump at his neck. Your mother nurses him with soaked cloths, urging him to sip ale. Your father talks of taking him to the monastery, though everyone knows the monks are overwhelmed. 3 days pass. The swelling grows, turns black. His breath becomes shallow. He cries out in agony and confusion. You and your parents take shifts by his side, terrified but unwilling to leave him alone. Then something strange happens. On the 4th day, instead of dying, his fever breaks. He's pale and weak, but aware. The lump at his neck softens, eventually bursting and draining. It's revolting but miraculous. He will survive. Why? You'll never know. But centuries later, science will uncover the truth. Some people carry a rare genetic mutation called Delta 32, which alters a protein called CCR5 on immune cells. This makes it harder for the bacteria to take hold. Your brother may be one of these rare survivors. His survival isn't just a miracle. It's evolution. That mysterious genetic twist, pure chance, really may have granted your family and others like it, a slim but powerful shield against the deadliest pandemic the world had ever known. Strangely enough, modern scientists would later discover that the same mutation not only provided some resistance to the plague, but also offered protection against a different killer, HIV, the virus responsible for AIDS. Though such knowledge is far in the future, the Black Death, by favoring those with this genetic edge, unknowingly helped protect their descendants from a disease that wouldn't exist for centuries to come. But all of that lies ahead. Right now, your family celebrates what feels like a miracle, your brother's recovery. Not every family is so lucky. As the weeks drag on, the plague's grip doesn't ease. Tightens. Your village, once bustling with the life of 200 souls, now counts fewer than half that number. Fields lie fallow, choked with weeds, as those who once tilled them are either buried or desperately nursing the sick. Even those with power and privilege are not spared. The lord of the manor, whose stone house looms above the village from its perch on the hill, has buried his wife and 2 children. His wealth offers no sanctuary from this invisible enemy. Oddly, though, some people seem untouched, immune even. The village gravedigger, a grim figure with a reputation for pilfering from the dead, handles plague-ridden bodies daily and never falls ill. A midwife continues to tend to both births and deathbeds, somehow emerging unscathed. Today, we might understand this as genetic resilience. But in your time, people see it as divine favor, or perhaps something more sinister. Whispers of dark pacts and sorcery follow these survivors. Meanwhile, life grows harder still. With trade disrupted and the harvest left to rot, food becomes precious. Prices for basics soar. Herbs thought to hold healing powers become worth their weight in silver. Religious relics, dubious in authenticity but rich in hope, fetch fortunes. Then winter arrives. Cold air chases away fleas, and rats retreat into burrows. The plague, without hosts or heat, begins to wane. Hope flickers, but it's a false lull. Comes spring, as the days lengthen and the world stirs to life again, the disease returns. The second wave finds fresh prey among the survivors of the first. Between 1347 and 1351, this nightmare plays out again and again, city after city, village after village. By the time it subsides, between 75 and 200 million people across Europe are dead, perhaps half the continent. And in that devastation, something begins to shift. Feudal systems falter. With so many dead, labor suddenly becomes a valuable commodity. Landowners, desperate for workers, begin to offer wages where once there were only commands. The unquestioned dominance of the nobility begins to wobble. Religious authority weakens too. People ask why their prayers went unanswered. Why did their priests flee or die? Where was God? The plague does not just kill, it dismantles. Beliefs, systems, certainties. In the ruins, survivors like your brother, the midwife, the gravedigger, must build something new. They are the fortunate ones, but they also bear a unique burden. The haunting weight of survival in a world forever altered. They will help rebuild society, reshape the balance between rulers and subjects, and lay the first stones of a different future. A world stepping slowly toward modernity. That, however, is a tale for another night. For now, you drift toward sleep. Outside, stars blink awake in a clear sky above your battered village. The night air carries the faint bark of a dog, the rustle of dry leaves, the breathing of those who remain. The plague, for the moment, is quiet. You are alive, and in that simple truth lies the greatest testament of all to humanity's strength, our ability to endure to adapt, and to begin again. Mourning brings a strange mixture of emotions. There is relief, of course. Your brother still lives, but also guilt. Why him? Why you? Why was your family spared when others vanished entirely? This is survivor's guilt, though no one has a name for it yet. The unsettling feeling of having lived when so many did not. Your brother is pale and thin, but his eyes are clear. The once swollen lump on his neck has left a dark, angry scar. It will remain with him always, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. But better a scar than a gravestone. Each step of his recovery feels like a gift. One evening, still weak but growing stronger, he asks, "Why did I live?" Your mother, lighting a tallow candle as twilight settles in, pauses before replying. "It was God's will," she says softly, but you can hear the hesitation in her voice. The real answer is far more complicated, far beyond the understanding of anyone in your world. Across human history, disease has played a cruel role in shaping who survives and who doesn't. Those with genetic defenses, hidden advantages in their blood and cells, pass on these traits. The Black Death becomes, in effect, an evolutionary filter. In your brother's body, and possibly in yours too, lives a mutation in the CCR5 gene, a small change in the code of life that creates a truncated protein, one that blocks the bacteria from hijacking the immune system. Those with one copy of this mutation are partially protected. A lucky few with two copies can resist the plague almost entirely. Your brother, it seems, holds one of those winning tickets in the cruel genetic lottery. But that lottery comes at a horrifying cost. Millions who didn't hold the same card. Millions who died so that those with resistance could pass it on. As your brother gains strength and finally steps outside, the village he returns to is hardly recognizable. Gardens that once brimmed with neat rows of vegetables are now overrun with weeds. Empty cottages lean at strange angles, their owners long dead or fled. The sounds of daily life, the hammer at the forge, the creak of the mill, the chatter at the well, have quieted. Yet even here, amid desolation, hope peeks through. A market day is organized, the smaller than before, but the energy is different, fierce, determined. Survivors gather to trade, to share news, to remind themselves that life still exists. Farmers arrive from distant fields, bringing what they've managed to grow. A merchant appears too, salt and spices in tow, and stories from afar. Everywhere, the stories are the same. Horror, grief, loss, but also recovery, rebirth. Cities, it's said, have suffered the worst. With their cramped quarters and poor sanitation, the plague devoured them whole. Some towns are now ghostly, their streets empty, churches silent. Whole monastic orders have perished. Noble lineages wiped clean from the earth. And yet, some places are healing. Villages like yours pull together. Orphans are taken in. Widows supported. Strangers help strangers. One tale in particular stays with you. In a nearby village, a woman named Elizabeth lost everything, her husband and 6 children, all within a single week. Alone, and with no one willing to come near, she buried each of them herself. And somehow, despite touching the plague at its most intimate and horrific, she survived. The merchant whispers that people call her a witch. They don't understand how she lived when others died. Some even wanted to drown her, but most were simply grateful. Someone had the strength to care for the dead when no one else would. Such suspicion is common now. People who survive the plague, especially women who live alone or act outside the norm, are often seen with fearful eyes. Superstition and ignorance flourish in tandem with disease. Your father, listening quietly, shakes his head. "It's not witchcraft," he says. "Some people are just built stronger." He places a steady hand on your brother's shoulder, pride and awe in his eyes. The merchant nods politely. He knows better than to argue with a paying customer. "Yes," he says, "in every village, there are those the plague cannot touch. Maybe they are chosen." Winter sets in early. The air bites, and darkness falls faster each day. Your village settles into a new rhythm. There are fewer mouths to feed, cold comfort perhaps, but also fewer hands to do the work. Firewood must still be chopped, livestock cared for, houses repaired. Survival doesn't pause just because death has passed by. Yet the shortage of labor begins to change things in subtle ways. Your father, once just another carpenter, now finds himself in demand. The lord of the manor, once used to giving orders and expecting obedience, comes to negotiate. And so the world begins to tilt. Before the plague, the local lord could have simply ordered your father's services. Now, in this new world, he negotiates. "He offered me a silver penny for 3 days' work." Your father tells your mother one evening, disbelief in his voice. "And a side of bacon, too?" Such pay would have been laughable, unthinkable before the pestilence. But now, with so many skilled laborers lost, those who remain find their abilities suddenly precious. These shifts ripple outward through every level of society. Agricultural workers, once taken for granted, now command higher wages. Household servants, especially those experienced in managing large estates, become hot commodities among noble families struggling to replace their depleted staff. Even women, long confined to domestic roles, find new footholds in this restructured world. Widows, who might have rushed into new marriages in the past, now often choose independence, continuing the trades or shops their late husbands left behind. Guild rules, which had long barred women from specific professions, are increasingly bent or ignored out of sheer necessity. One nearby woman, for example, inherits her husband's forge. She takes up the blacksmith's hammer herself, scandalizing some but becoming indispensable to all. No one else can shoe horses or repair tools with her skill. For serfs, peasants once legally chained to the land, the plague brings mobility never seen before. Many landlords, desperate for anyone to keep their fields productive, offer them freedom in exchange for labor. Others don't wait to be offered. They simply leave, heading toward towns or other manors where conditions are better. And with half the population gone, who is left to stop them? The old systems are crumbling, and the means to enforce them vanish with the bodies. These changes don't happen overnight. The feudal structure, centuries old, doesn't collapse in a single season. But the cracks have formed. The roots of transformation take hold in the soil of post-plague Europe. Your family adapts as best it can. Your brother grows stronger each day, though fatigue still lingers. Your father, now a highly sought-after carpenter, brings home more than he ever has. Your mother picks up laundry work for the manor, once considered menial, now more generously paid due to labor scarcity. And you find an opportunity you never imagined. The local priest, one of the few clergy who neither succumbed to illness nor abandoned his flock, needs help recording deaths and managing church records. You, having been taught to read and write by your mother, herself once a servant in a noble household, are chosen for the task. It's rare for a peasant child to be literate, and even rarer to find one with neat handwriting and a steady mind. Spring arrives again. The world blooms. Crops sprout, birds return, flowers color the hills. But beauty is no protection. Warmth awakens more than blossoms. It stirs the fleas and rats that carry the plague. And soon, as feared, cases reappear. A second wave. It is not as deadly as the first. Fewer people remain to be infected, and many survivors may carry partial resistance. Still, every new death reopens old wounds. Grief, barely buried, surges again. One quiet afternoon, as you help the priest update the church's death register, a grim role that has grown too familiar, you finally ask, "Father, why did God send the plague?" The priest, lines of fatigue etched deep into his face, stops writing. "Some believe it's punishment for our sins," he says slowly. "Others say it's a test of faith. The Holy Father has called for prayer and fasting." He adds another name to the list. "But I've seen the most devout die in agony, and the worst sinners walk away untouched. I've prayed beside innocent children as they gasp their last breath." He sighs long and tired. "Perhaps it's not for us to understand. Such uncertainty isn't unique to your priest. All across Europe, faith is shaken. If this truly is divine punishment, why are the good punished alongside the wicked? Why do prayers go unanswered? Why do holy monasteries suffer higher death rates than brothels?" The once unshakable authority of the church begins to crack. Not collapse, at least not yet, but weaken. People begin to question. Quietly but persistently, medicine fares no better. Learned physicians, trained in the best universities, are as powerless against the plague as humble village healers. Their theories, imbalanced humors, astrological alignments, cannot explain why some live and others die, why one village is spared and another destroyed. Some doctors bravely remain, tending to the sick until they fall themselves. Others flee at the first rumor of infection, choosing self-preservation over service. Those who stay wear elaborate costumes, waxed robes, gloves, and strange beaked masks filled with herbs thought to purify the air. These plague doctor outfits, eerie and iconic, do almost nothing to stop the disease. In the absence of effective treatments, communities devise their own responses. Some are rooted in superstition, charms, amulets, avoidance of red-haired people or black cats. Others, more practical, prove unexpectedly helpful, isolating the sick, burning contaminated items, improving hygiene. Your village embraces both kinds. Homes struck by plague are marked with white crosses. Outsiders must spend 3 days in a separate hut before entering. The dead are buried swiftly with minimal ritual. Their belongings are burned. These measures help, but only so much. By midsummer, another dozen have died. For a village already decimated, it's a brutal blow. One of the dead is the lord of the manor, a man who survived the first wave only to fall to the second. He was in his 50s, strong, respected, but not invincible. His death sends shockwaves through the local order. His son, barely 20 and freshly returned from university in Paris, inherits the estate. This young nobleman, exposed to fresh philosophies and ideas, governs differently than his father. He understands the labor shortage, the shift in power. He offers fairer leases, grants freedom to serfs willing to stay and work, and elevates skilled workers like your father to positions of respect. Not all nobles are so wise. In nearby estates, some lords cling stubbornly to the past, enforcing old laws more fiercely, punishing peasants for leaving or demanding fair wages. but it rarely works. People simply vanish in the night, seeking better conditions elsewhere. Land is plentiful. Workers are not. The second wave eventually fades as autumn sets in. Your village survives, smaller, scarred, but still standing. Of the original 200 residents, perhaps 90 remain. The community adapts. Empty homes are scavenged for lumber and thatch. Farmland is consolidated. Crops are prioritized. Life somehow goes on. Children laugh again in the square. The routines of farming, sowing, tending, harvesting, resume, shaped to fit fewer hands. Weddings bring color back to the church. Babies are born. Trade picks up. Then, on a cool autumn morning, a man walks into the village. Sunburned, road-weary, but familiar. It's a mason who left years ago, chasing work in the cities. I built walls for the cathedral in Florence, he tells anyone who'll listen. Then the plague came. He describes horror. Half the city gone, bodies stacked in the streets. The rich fled. The poor had nowhere to run. I survived. Don't ask me how. With rebuilding priorities shifting, his work dried up. So he returned, seeking something simpler, something safe. His story is one of thousands. All across Europe, the plague drives people out of cities. For generations, people had flocked to urban centers. Now they run from them. Infected air, crowded homes, filth. Cities are no longer places of promise. This unexpected migration benefits villages like yours. Those who return bring skills, knowledge, and stories. They speak of strange innovations. Public clocks that ring on the hour, aqueducts bringing fresh water, merchants who trade through letters and banks. The Mason describes Florence not ruled by birthright, but by elected guild leaders, men of trade and skill. He speaks of machines, of systems, of a world beyond your experience. These ideas, once distant and irrelevant, now take root. The plague has not just cracked the walls of society. It has cracked minds open. For your family, life goes on in this altered world. Your brother, healthy once more, though forever marked by his survival, though forever marked by his brush with death, your brother begins a new chapter. He apprentices with the returning mason, learning a valued trade that promises security in this reshaped world. Skilled labor is no longer taken for granted. It's sought after, respected. Your father continues carpentry work, now commanding earnings he could never have imagined before the plague. Meanwhile, your mother gives up washing clothes and turns her focus to cultivating an herb garden. Remedies made from her plants are in high demand, especially since the plague took many of the region's traditional healers. You remain in service to the priest, organizing parish records, a task for which your literacy and clarity of thought make you invaluable. In a society where few can read or write, especially among the peasantry, your abilities now open doors that would have been locked tight just a few years ago. In the old world, your birth alone would have capped your future, no matter your talents. But in this altered world, where boundaries are shifting and talent is needed more than ever, opportunities stretch out before you. One evening, as your family sits around the hearth, eating a supper more generous than you could have dreamed of in the years before the plague, your father breaks a thoughtful silence. It feels awful to say, he begins carefully, but for those of us still alive, life is better than it was. Your mother nods. More food, better wages, more freedom, she says softly. Her words hang in the air. Beneath the surface of this improved life lies a stark and uncomfortable truth. All of this, opportunity, mobility, abundance, has been bought with the lives of countless others, built on the ashes of tragedy. For those who survived, whether by genetics, by luck, or by isolation, this new world holds promise that the old one never could. The reduction in population reshapes society. Land, once scarce and controlled, is suddenly available. Work, once underpaid and undervalued, becomes precious. Rigid hierarchies loosen, old roles crack, and for the first time, those who were invisible before are seen. But none of it comes without cost. Entire families gone, communities ripped apart, libraries of knowledge, oral traditions, skills, lost with those who carried them. Even joy is tinged with guilt. No one who lived through this time escapes unchanged. That night, as you drift to sleep, a thought lingers. This isn't over. The plague has receded, yes, but everyone knows it can return. And it will, just as it has before. Still, humanity will endure. Again and again, through every outbreak, people will adapt. Responses will evolve. Knowledge will build. And centuries from now, the enemy you face, unseen and relentless, will finally be named, understood, and controlled. You sleep unaware that you're living through a hinge point in history, a moment when everything shifts. The world that rises from the ruins of the Black Death will be fundamentally new. Feudal structures begin their slow unraveling. Religious authority, once absolute, shows its first cracks. The seeds of the Renaissance are being sown here, in the minds of survivors, in the freedoms newly discovered, in the questions quietly asked. And on a biological level, something even deeper is happening. The plague is reshaping the human genome. Those who survive carry within them genetic advantages that will ripple across generations. Your brother's endurance isn't just a lucky break. It's part of a larger pattern, an evolutionary reply to the microbial threats that stalk our species. In surviving, he contributes to the gradual rewriting of human resistance itself. Tomorrow, as another sun rises over this transformed world, you will continue the work of repair, of adaptation, of progress. That's what plague survivors have always done. They carry the pain of memory while building forward. And in doing so, they leave behind a legacy that will echo for centuries. The story you followed of plague, loss, resilience, and rebirth in 14th century Europe is just one chapter in a much longer tale. So as you gently drift deeper into sleep, let's carry our story forward. Let's travel ahead in time to a different village, a different century, and another extraordinary moment when ordinary people faced the unthinkable. It is now the year 1665. 300 years have passed since the first merciless wave of the Black Death tore through Europe. And we arrive in the summer warmth of a small English village called Eyam, pronounced E-M, nestled in the rolling hills of Derbyshire. Eyam is home to about 800 people, most of them farmers or lead miners working the rich seams of or beneath the limestone. Life here flows with a familiar rural rhythm. Sunrise brings chores in the fields, mining underground, or tending livestock. Sundays are for church at St. Lawrence's. Evenings are spent at the tavern, sharing laughter, gossip, and comfort. Generations have lived and died here. Families stretch back centuries. Bonds of kinship and neighborly duty run deep. But none of them know what is coming. In London, the plague is back. Once again, the disease sweeps through the capital, this time in what will become known as the Great Plague of 1665. An estimated 100,000 Londoners will die, nearly a quarter of the city's population. But in Eyam, the threat feels distant. The plague is a city's curse, not a country village's concern. The hills and meadows feel like natural defenses. Isolation is safety. Then, in late August, a package arrives. It's addressed to a tailor named Alexander Hadfield. Inside is cloth from London, likely a fashionable new pattern unavailable locally. Hadfield's assistant, George Vickers, opens it. The cloth feels damp after its journey, so George hangs it near the hearth to dry. He doesn't know that among the folds, fleas lurk, fleas carrying death. Within days, George falls ill. Fever grips him. His neck and armpits swell with painful lumps, the telltale buboes. He deteriorates rapidly. By September 7th, he's dead. Eam's first victim. Panic spreads, for more villagers die by the end of the month. The plague has entered Eam, and it is not leaving. Autumn comes. More and more people fall sick. Entire households are infected. Death becomes part of daily life. The village graveyard overflows. Families begin burying their loved ones in gardens or pastures. As fear grows, so does the urge to flee. Wealthy villagers prepare to leave. In London, even King Charles II and his court have escaped to country estates. But in Eam, something extraordinary happens. Two men, Reverend William Mompesson, the recently appointed Anglican rector, and his Puritan predecessor Thomas Stanley, put aside their theological differences. Together, they approach the villagers with a proposal that will define Eam for all of history. They suggest a quarantine. No one leaves. No one enters. The plague will be contained. This decision is monumental. It means certain death for many, but it could save thousands beyond the village. Neighbors, nearby towns, strangers. Remarkably, the villagers agree. The borders of Eam become sacred lines. Outsiders bring food and supplies, leaving them at boundary stones in exchange for coins left soaking in vinegar, believed to disinfect the money. The Earl of Devonshire, from nearby Chatsworth House, promises to keep the village supplied. And so begins one of history's most poignant examples of sacrifice in the face of infectious disease. Through autumn, through the icy grip of winter, and into spring, the plague burns through Eam. Families are decimated. Parents bury children and then follow them. Homes are boarded shut. Fields lie untouched. Yet from this darkness emerge stories of strength almost beyond belief. One such story belongs to Elizabeth Hancock. She lives at Riley Farm at the village's edge. In just 8 days during August 1666, she loses her husband and 6 children. No one dares approach her home. So Elizabeth, alone, carries each lifeless body to a nearby field and buries them herself. But she never falls ill. Despite touching death directly, again and again, she survives. Like your brother centuries earlier, Elizabeth may carry a powerful genetic resistance. We now know that some people possess a mutation called CCR5 delta 3-2 that can block infections like the plague and, much later, even HIV. That same CCR5 delta 3-2 mutation, the genetic anomaly that confers resistance to the plague, may well have lived inside Elizabeth Hancock's DNA. Today, scientists can only speculate, but her astonishing survival, after such intimate exposure to death, strongly hints at this protective trait. The 7 humble headstones she placed with her own hands still stand in the fields of Eam, collectively known now as the Riley Graves, a solemn monument to both unbearable sorrow and fierce endurance. Another figure from the village's story is Marshall Howe, Eam's unofficial gravedigger. As death tightened its grip, Howe took on the morbid duty of burying the fallen. But his motivations weren't exactly altruistic. Before committing a body to the earth, he'd often help himself to whatever valuables remained in the house. He looted with grim efficiency, moving from one plague-stricken home to the next. And yet, despite handling dozens, perhaps even hundreds of infected corpses, despite walking straight into plague-ridden rooms most feared to even approach, Howe never fell ill. Logic suggests he should have been among the first to perish. But he survived. Modern genetic research offers a clue. He may have possessed that same rare mutation, a tiny alteration in DNA that prevented the Yersinia pestis bacterium from penetrating his cells. What seemed like divine favor or sheer luck was likely biology quietly asserting its edge in the ancient struggle between humans and microbes. Eames records also tell the heartbreaking story of two young lovers, Emmett Siddall and Roland Torrey, whose devotion endured despite the quarantine. Emmett lived within the village, Roland just beyond the boundaries. When the cordon was established, they were suddenly cut off from one another. But love, determined and hopeful, found a way. The two arranged to meet at Cucklet Delph, a narrow ravine along the edge of Eames' quarantine perimeter. From opposite sides, well out of reach, they would talk, wave, and reassure one another from afar. Moments of light in a season of darkness. These distant meetings sustained them for months. But as summer approached and the plague reached its cruel peak, Emmett stopped coming. Roland continued his pilgrimages to the ravine, calling her name, waiting in silence, hoping against hope. Only after the quarantine finally lifted did he learn the truth. Emmett had died in April. Her love, like so many others in Eam, was buried too soon. Their story remains one of the village's most enduring legends, a tale of love that held on until death itself forced release. Then there's the strange case of Margaret Blackwell. Struck by plague symptoms and presumed doomed, she was left for dead by her brother Francis. Delirious and fevered, Margaret somehow dragged herself to the kitchen. Driven by desperate thirst, she mistook a pot of bacon fat for milk and drank it. And then she recovered. The villagers, astonished, claimed the bacon fat had cured her. For generations, the story passed from mouth to mouth, evolving into folk wisdom. But modern understanding suggests a simpler explanation. Margaret likely carried the genetic mutation, and her recovery was less a miracle than a genetic defense hardwired into her immune system. Still, the tale endured, illustrating how desperately people clung to even the most implausible remedies when faced with the unsolvable terror of plague. All through this, Eames' spiritual leaders offered what comfort they could. Reverend William Mompesson, who had helped initiate the quarantine alongside the more austere Thomas Stanley, paid a steep personal price for his bravery. His wife, Catherine, fell ill while tending to the sick and died in August 1666, in his arms. Afterward, Mompesson described himself as a broken man, barely able to go on. In a letter to his children, who had been safely sent away, he wrote, "The condition of this place is very sad. I entreat you to fly this place. I am not in a condition to receive comfort from you. I am so weak I can write no more." And yet, despite the weight of grief, he remained. He continued to lead services, now held in the open air at Cucklet Delph, where distance and breeze reduced the risk of infection. The villagers, spaced widely apart, prayed together. Even when death knocked daily, their rituals gave them something to hold on to. These outdoor gatherings were, in essence, an early form of social distancing. Of course, not all behaved nobly. There were incidents of theft, of people refusing to help one another, of panic overtaking empathy. One villager, Mary Cooper, attempted to flee to nearby Sheffield but was caught and returned. Yet those were exceptions. The overwhelming narrative of Eames is one of sacrifice. Collective, willing, extraordinary sacrifice. When the plague finally loosened its hold in November 1666, it had claimed the lives of more than 250 of Eames' original 800 residents. Some family names vanished entirely. The very fabric of village life had been ripped apart. But the quarantine worked. The contagion was contained. The neighboring towns and villages, almost certainly doomed had Eames residents scattered, were spared. Thousands lived because hundreds chose not to run. In the aftermath, the survivors began the painful work of rebuilding. They couldn't know the legacy they had created. They couldn't foresee that centuries later, their story would be remembered as one of history's most remarkable acts of communal courage. They had no way of knowing that their decision would become a case study in pandemic ethics or that future scientists would study their bloodlines, finding an unusually high prevalence of that CCR5 Delta 3-2 mutation among their descendants, living proof that natural selection had been at work. Nor could they imagine that, over 350 years later, the world would once again face a global pandemic and look back to Eames for guidance. But in that moment, they simply knew they had survived the unimaginable. They had watched their friends, family, neighbors die in wave after wave of suffering. They had stood firm in isolation through blazing summer and freezing winter. And now, as silence replaced the sound of church bells tolling for the dead, they had to do what humans have always done: keep going. The recovery wasn't easy. Far from it. Fields lay wild. Shops stood abandoned. Roofs sagged from months of neglect. Children wandered orphaned. Widows and widowers faced decisions about remarrying, about reshaping families from the pieces of those lost. Entire lines were gone, raising questions of inheritance, of ownership, of identity. And yet, life found a way. The resilient survivors formed new families. Distant kin returned to stake claims and rebuild. Laborers, scarce and sorely needed, could now set terms once unthinkable, asking fair pay for their work. As in the 14th century, the plague had again acted as a brutal but effective filter, leaving behind not just those who endured, but those whose bodies were biologically better prepared for the microscopic war they never asked to fight. Psychological wounds, however, often outlast physical ones. Elizabeth Hancock remarried and bore more children, yet villagers spoke of a far-off look in her eyes, a ghostly weight she seemed always to carry. Perhaps she never fully left the grave field where her first family lay. Marshall Howe, the gravedigger who profited from plague, found himself increasingly shunned. His actions, tolerated when necessary, were now remembered with distaste. Immunity did not equal redemption. Reverend Mompesson left Eames in 1669, accepting another post. He remarried and lived into his 70s, but the letters he left behind speak of a man haunted by the memory of mass graves and Catherine's final breath. The village slowly healed. Population numbers gradually returned, but some surnames vanished forever from the records. And the story of what Eames had endured became part of its very soil, passed down from generation to generation. By the 1800s, as Victorian England developed a fascination with local legends and moral tales, Eames' ordeal re-emerged into public attention. It was dubbed the Plague Village, and the sites of its suffering became points of reverence. Visitors arrived to see the Riley graves, the boundary stones, the churchyard, the delph. By the 21st century, Eames had transformed into a site of remembrance and resilience. A museum chronicled the events. Artifacts were carefully preserved. Annual services honored the dead and celebrated the strength of the living. But Eam is not merely a museum piece. It remains a village, living, breathing, evolving. Its people walk among reminders of past pain, but they also carry forward its lessons. That collective sacrifice can save countless lives. That humanity's strength lies not only in resistance but in compassion. That our ancestors were not just victims of fate, but active agents of survival. Eam remains a living village where descendants of plague survivors still walk its narrow lanes. Some bear the very same surnames etched into 17th century gravestones: Hancocks, Sidalls, Blackwells. Genetic studies reveal that a notable portion of the local population still carries the CCR5 delta 3-2 mutation, perhaps the very gene that helped their ancestors endure the plague's wrath centuries ago. The story of Eam reminds us that history isn't just a ledger of names and dates. It's a living chronicle of people, real people, who stood at the brink of oblivion and chose sacrifice, resilience, and compassion. Their choices shaped more than just their village. They shaped the world you and I live in today. As the night deepens and you nestle more comfortably into the warmth of sleep, let your thoughts drift to modern-day Eam. Imagine its tidy stone cottages and flowering gardens. On the surface, it's peaceful, even idyllic. But beneath that quiet beauty lies a powerful story. You can still visit the boundary stones, see the Riley graves tended with care, read the plaques honoring those who gave everything. The villagers didn't lock themselves down to make history. They did it for their neighbors, those in nearby hamlets and towns, for people they would never meet. Their decision was born not of a desire for legacy, but out of sheer humanity. And perhaps that's what makes it so profound. True heroism doesn't look for applause, simply does what's right. In an age that often praises individual success over communal good, Eam reminds us of the extraordinary strength of collective will. When called upon by tragedy, humans can still rise, together. Tomorrow night, we'll explore how the world reshaped itself in the wake of these pandemics, how governments responded, how societies rebuilt, how biology quietly evolved. But for now, let the image of Eam, the quiet courage of its people, guide your dreams, a silent promise that even in the darkest moments, hope persists. Let's return now to the aftermath of the Black Death of the 14th century. While Eam stands as a remarkable testament to one village's sacrifice, the pandemic of the 1300s altered entire civilizations. As we sink deeper into our historical reverie, step once more into that small village we first visited, now set in the year 1352. The worst of the plague has passed, leaving a landscape forever changed. Your village, once a community of 200, now counts fewer than 90. Abandoned cottages slump along the road, roofs sagging, windows dark. Weeds climb through doorways where laughter once lived. But from this devastation, change is beginning to take root. Changes that will ripple across Europe. Outside the village, the impact is visible immediately. Before the plague, every scrap of usable land was cultivated. Even rocky, infertile ground was farmed out of necessity because too many mouths needed feeding. Now, with half the population gone, laborers focus only on the best fields. Poor soils are abandoned. This concentration boosts harvests dramatically. Where families once scraped by, they now find abundance. For those left standing, food is no longer scarce. There's wheat enough to fill granaries, and fewer people to consume it. For the first time in generations, peasants eat until they are full. After lifetimes spent teetering on the edge of starvation, the simple act of a full belly feels like a miracle. Diet improves as well. Where once bread and ale sustained the poor, now meat appears more frequently on the table. With fewer tenants, more land is converted to pasture. Cheese, butter, even fresh vegetables become part of the average meal. And as nutrition improves, so does health. People grow taller, children stronger, but the most seismic shift is not on the plate, it's in power. The plague didn't just wipe out people. It shattered the old economic equilibrium. With so many workers gone, labor becomes precious. For the first time in memory, peasants find themselves in a position to negotiate. Take Thomas Fletcher, a plowman from your village. Before the plague, he toiled 6 days a week in exchange for a tiny strip of land. He had no leverage. If he complained, the Lord could replace him in a heartbeat. But now the steward comes to Thomas with an offer: twice the land, half the labor, and freedom to work for wages elsewhere on days off. Thomas, once a faceless cog in a vast machine, is suddenly indispensable. This story repeats across Europe. Serfs, formerly tied to the land by law and custom, are granted their freedom. Lords desperate for help offer rents instead of forced labor. A new kind of peasant emerges. Tenant farmers who pay for land and labor on their own terms. For skilled workers, the changes are even more dramatic. Masons, blacksmiths, weavers, anyone with a useful craft, find themselves in high demand. Wages surge. A carpenter once confined to rags now wears wool. A mason builds himself a house with glazed windows. These people were once invisible. Now they're essential, and the elite don't like it. All across Europe, panic takes hold among nobles and wealthy merchants. They see the world tipping out of their favor. To stop the shift, governments rush to impose laws. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers 1349 and the Statute of Labourers 1351 try to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and make it illegal for workers to seek better pay elsewhere. Other countries follow suit. France enacts wage controls. Florence tries the same. Castile clamps down on peasant migration. But enforcement fails. The labor shortage is too severe. Officials in rural districts, reliant on the goodwill of local workers, ignore violations. Farmers work slowly unless offered better terms. Carpenters accept gifts of clothing or food as part of their pay. The law becomes a fiction. This tension between rising expectations and desperate repression builds to a boil. In France, it erupts in 1358 with the Jacquerie Rebellion. Peasants take up arms and storm noble manors. In England, frustration simmers for decades until 1381, when the peasants' revolt explodes. Led by Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and the radical preacher John Ball, tens of thousands march on London. They demand an end to serfdom, repeal of oppressive taxes, and a society where worth isn't tied to birth. John Ball asks the question that rattles kingdoms. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Though the revolt is eventually crushed through lies and violence, its echo lingers. Never again will peasants accept powerlessness so easily. The seeds of future revolutions are planted in these moments. Cities too change. Urban centers were hit hardest by the plague. Narrow streets, foul water, crowded living. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Yet in rebuilding, cities adopt new systems. Sanitation improves, trade guilds grow stronger, and early versions of public health measures appear. Florence, devastated but determined, becomes a crucible of creativity. artists and thinkers flourish in the void left behind. It is here that the Renaissance will begin to bloom. Some of Europe's largest cities lost up to 75% of their population. The devastation was unimaginable, but for those who survived, the absence of so many created space. Literally and metaphorically, in urban centers once crammed with families squeezed into single rooms, housing suddenly became abundant and affordable. Workshops and market stalls stood empty. Where once there had been waiting lists for apprenticeships, now young workers were fast-tracked to master status. With guilds hollowed out by death, senior positions opened to younger, less experienced members, sometimes overnight. And for women, opportunities opened where previously there had only been locked doors. Consider Margarita, the widow of a weaver in a modest market town. Before the plague, she could assist her husband at the loom but could never own a weaving business herself. Guild laws barred women from full membership. But when her husband died, leaving behind his tools, a well-equipped workshop, and years of skill Margarita had quietly acquired, the guild had to make a choice. Enforce the rule and lose a productive artisan or adapt to survive. They adapted. Margarita was accepted into the guild as a full member, one of many exceptions made across Europe as institutions bent to necessity. Though many of these gains would later be rolled back for a time, sometimes even for generations, women enjoyed wider roles in business, trade, and property management than ever before. The aftermath of the plague wasn't just about who did what, it reshaped how people thought, how they created, how they lived. Art, architecture, and fashion took a turn. The trauma of mass death cultivated a strange duality: fascination with mortality and a fierce embrace of life's pleasures. The dance of death, or danse macabre, became a recurring motif in murals and manuscripts. Skeletal figures led nobles, peasants, clergy, all equal now in procession to the grave. At the same time, clothing became more vivid, luxurious, even ostentatious. Where once practicality and modesty defined peasant and noble alike, post-plague fashion reflected survival and status. Rich fabrics, bold dyes, and elaborate cuts flooded markets. Survivors wanted to live and to look like they had survived. This alarmed the elites. Sumptuary laws sprang up, dictating who could wear what. Commoners were forbidden silks, velvets, or jewelry by decree, but enforcement was laughable. When the artisan's wife had gold in her purse and a tailor in her family, who could stop her from dressing like a duchess? Religious life, too, was undergoing upheaval. The church, an institution that had shaped every aspect of medieval life, entered crisis. Some clergy had fled in fear, abandoning their flocks. Others remained and perished. Whole monasteries vanished. Monastic scriptoria, where knowledge had been painstakingly preserved for centuries, lay silent. Authority crumbled not just physically but spiritually. People began to ask questions, dangerous ones. If this was God's punishment, why did the faithful perish with the wicked? Why did monasteries, centers of devotion, suffer more than taverns and markets? If prayer was the remedy, why had it failed so completely? The answers never came. In this vacuum, two divergent responses emerged. Some turned deeper into faith, convinced their survival was divine favor and owed a life of gratitude. Others grew skeptical, wary of institutions that offered certainty and delivered silence. The latter spirit would quietly ferment for centuries. Combined with newfound wealth among artisans, an increase in leisure time, and rising literacy, this questioning would help ignite the Renaissance. As fewer hands were needed to produce life's basics, More minds could explore art, science, philosophy. Education slowly shifted from a priestly privilege to a societal ambition. Merchants wanted their sons and sometimes daughters to read, calculate, correspond. Schools sprouted in towns and even rural villages, teaching both scripture and skills. Technological innovation also surged, driven by scarcity. Watermills, once just for grinding grain, were reimagined, powering bellows and furnaces, driving hammers in smithies, fulling cloth. The pressing need to reduce reliance on labor accelerated invention. Scarcity became mother not just of invention, but of revolution. One quiet but transformative leap came in printing. Manuscripts had once been hand-copied by monks, a process slow, expensive, and fragile. After the plague, skilled scribes were rare and costly. The economic demand for efficiency, combined with intellectual hunger, created fertile ground for the printing press. By the mid-1400s, movable type had arrived. Ideas could now travel farther and faster than ever before. But perhaps the greatest change was psychological. Before the Black Death, Europe had largely accepted that the world was fixed. Social classes, laws, customs, unchanging. That was the order of things. But when half the population vanished in a blink, that illusion shattered. Suddenly, it was clear the world could change. Drastically, quickly. If the church could fail, if kings could die, if peasants could gain land and wealth, then maybe nothing was permanent. A new awareness spread that human society, once seen as ordained and static, could be reimagined. Most of these ideas wouldn't find full expression for generations, but the seeds were planted. The barrier to change, so heavy and immovable, was cracked. Through that crack, light would eventually pour. Of course, not every transformation was glorious. Landowners suffered, too. With fewer tenants, many estates collapsed. Churches and charities, reliant on steady rents, found their coffers empty. Abandoned properties became dens for thieves. Some towns struggled to enforce law and order with fewer watchmen. Crime, drunkenness, and disorder rose in places where economic strain mixed with social breakdown. And the plague didn't end in one clean wave. Smaller outbreaks continued for decades, periodically shaking communities and delaying population recovery. Only by the late 15th century did Europe's population begin to climb again. And in many areas, it wasn't until the 1600s that numbers returned to pre-plague levels. This long pause had consequences. The labor shortages, power shifts, and social fluidity weren't fleeting. They became the new normal. Even as populations recovered, the world they returned to was fundamentally changed. Now return, for a moment, to that peasant family we followed. Your brother, once miraculously recovered, now runs not just your family's field, but one left behind by a childless neighbor. He's a landholder now, something unthinkable a generation ago. Your father's carpentry thrives. He's hired to help repair the church roof, damaged by years of neglect and mourning. His pay is generous enough to buy luxuries. A second room on your home, a raised wooden floor, iron hinges on the door. Comforts once beyond imagination. Your mother teaches you and your sister to read. She learned long ago as a servant in a wealthy household. Back then, her knowledge was rare and mostly unused. But now, literacy is power. She ensures her children can wield it. One autumn night, you're all gathered near the hearth. The fire crackles. Bread bakes in the coals. Your father looks at you thoughtfully. The Abbey, he says. They're looking for someone who can write their ledgers, pays well. Clean work. Would you consider it? Your brother snorts with laughter. You? A clerk? What would grandfather say? You grin, but the idea takes hold. Why not? A peasant child, once destined to live and die on the same patch of earth, now has choices. The world is shifting, and your story, once written in dirt and labor, might soon be ink on parchment. Clerical work, something that once felt entirely out of reach, no longer seems absurd. In previous generations, rigid social classes were as fixed as the stars in the night sky. But now, as you drift to sleep, the idea no longer feels foolish. It feels possible. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of the Black Death. Not just higher wages or land redistribution, but a shift in what people believe they can become. The boundaries of imagination have expanded. As dawn nears and our journey through plague-ravaged medieval Europe slows, we leave you resting in this moment of quiet hope. A world fractured by horror begins rebuilding itself into something new. The certainties that once governed life, unchallenged and eternal, have been cracked open. What you cannot yet realize, as a survivor of this great transformation, is that you are standing at a fulcrum of Western history. The adaptations, inventions, and new perspectives born of this trauma will ignite the Renaissance, fuel the Reformation, and lay foundations for the modern age. That's a story we'll complete on our final night together. But for now, let's begin to widen the frame. Let's look beyond villages and churches, past fields and hearths, and follow the long, unbroken ripple of the Black Death as it moves through centuries, resonating in our bodies, our institutions, and our ideas of what illness truly means. And where better to begin than with our biology? Remember the CCR5 Delta 3-2 mutation? That rare genetic twist that made some medieval Europeans resistant to plague? It didn't vanish when the disease receded. It persisted, passed quietly down family lines, strengthened by generations of survivors who carried it. By the late 20th century, it still lingered in the European gene pool, particularly among descendants of those hardest hit. Now leap forward to the 1980s and 1990s. A new virus appears, HIV. A global pandemic unfolds. As doctors search for answers, they find something extraordinary. Some people, despite repeated exposure to the virus, never contract it. They seem immune. The mystery leads scientists to the same culprit, or rather, the same protector, the CCR5 Delta 3-2 mutation. The very same gene that helped fend off Yersinia pestis centuries ago now shields modern humans from a totally different invader. Both HIV and the plague bacteria use the CCR5 protein to enter human cells. The mutation alters that protein, locking the door shut. What began as nature's response to one pandemic ends up saving lives in another. Researchers soon develop medications that mimic the mutation's effect, blocking CCR5 as a method of HIV treatment. In an astonishing way, the survival of a medieval blacksmith or a Derbyshire widow shaped the tools of modern medicine. But that's not the end of the biological legacy. The Black Death, acting as a brutal filter, shaped more than one gene. It likely influenced entire immune system patterns in Europeans. Today's population, descended overwhelmingly from those who lived through the plague, bears the imprint of that event. And sometimes those genetic advantages come with a cost. Some scientists believe that the same heightened immune responses that helped survivors beat the plague might now predispose their descendants to autoimmune disorders. Rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, lupus. These conditions, where the immune system mistakenly attacks the body, are more common in people of European ancestry. It's a haunting irony. The very adaptations that once preserved life may now stir new struggles. This is what pandemics do. They don't just kill and vanish. They reshape humanity, its genes, its populations, its vulnerabilities, long after the final body is buried. And the reshaping wasn't just biological. The plague's economic and social upheaval didn't evaporate once populations stabilized. While some changes, like wage surges and job flexibility, faded as Europe recovered, others took root and grew deeper over generations. Take serfdom, the backbone of feudal Europe. In much of Western Europe, it never fully recovered from the Black Death's disruption. Lords tried to restore the old rules, but the numbers were no longer on their side. There was too much land, too few workers. Peasants gained bargaining power and increasingly rented land or worked for pay, breaking free from hereditary servitude. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom was all but gone in places like England, France, and the Low Countries. In its place rose tenant farming, wage labor, and new forms of rural independence. Fields were still tilled, crops still harvested, but the people doing the work were no longer bound by law or lineage. They were, in a real sense, freer. But this evolution wasn't universal. In Eastern Europe, the story unfolded in reverse. Their nobles succeeded in tightening their grip. They reasserted serfdom, even expanded it, a process historians call the second serfdom. Peasants who had tasted mobility were now trapped more firmly than ever. This East-West divide in freedom and social mobility would shape European development for centuries to come. The Church, too, changed forever. In the plague's wake, its spiritual authority fractured. Why had prayers failed? Why had monks and nuns, those closest to God, died just as swiftly as thieves? Doubts fermented. The faithful still filled pews, but beneath devotion bubbled uncertainty. These doubts would one day explode into revolution. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century didn't arise in a vacuum. Its roots trace back to the plague years, when belief in infallible religious institutions first faltered. The bold voices of Martin Luther and John Calvin echoed earlier whispers of disillusionment. Their calls for reform fell on ears already primed by pain. Even art changed. Medieval images, once dominated by saints and salvation, began to include darker themes. The dance of death became a popular motif, skeletons dancing with kings and paupers alike. It was a reminder that death comes for all. Still life paintings filled with skulls, wilting flowers, and extinguished candles reminded viewers of mortality and fleeting time. This wasn't just morbid fascination. It marked a pivot from divine idealism to human realism, from heavenly visions to lived emotion. This shift in perspective helped ignite the Renaissance. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, a renewed interest in human reason and creativity. It all grew from soil broken by plague. Even language carried the scars. Take the word quarantine. It comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. During Venetian plague outbreaks, ships were forced to wait offshore for 40 days before unloading, in hopes of preventing infection, or considered deadline. Originally, it was a literal line drawn around plague zones or prison camps. Crossing it meant death. Some scholars even argue that Ring Around the Rosie, the childhood rhyme, may echo plague imagery. A rosy rash, pockets full of posies meant to mask the stench, ashes of cremated bodies, and falling down in death. While debated, it reflects how deeply plague memory seeped into cultural consciousness. Perhaps most importantly, the plague redefined how people thought about illness. Before, disease was punishment from heaven, or perhaps an imbalance of humors. The idea that sickness could spread, could move from person to person in a predictable pattern, that was new. But the plague forced recognition. It swept along trade routes, followed armies, moved with travelers. Communities couldn't help but notice. Sickness traveled. Even without germ theory, people began acting on observation. Cities isolated infected households. Ships were quarantined. Contaminated clothing burned. These weren't accidents. They were practical, life-saving responses born of raw experience. Over time, these ad hoc measures hardened into policy. By the 1500s, some cities had appointed public health boards, groups with authority to shut down markets, close roads, even burn homes during plague outbreaks. Marseilles, during its 1720 epidemic, implemented lockdowns, checkpoints, and sanitation protocols that kept the outbreak largely confined to that city. Long before microscopes revealed bacteria, people had learned to fight disease with wisdom gathered in pain. The quarantine measures that once felt desperate and improvised in plague-ridden towns later became the foundation for managing epidemics across Europe. Though they came too late to save the millions lost during the first outbreak, the hard lessons learned during the Black Death were not forgotten. They shaped the way communities handled later crises. When cholera swept through Europe in the 19th century, public health officials turned to plague-era strategies: quarantines, sanitation controls, cordon zones. These methods were crude at first, but they gradually improved as scientific understanding advanced. The ripple effects of the Black Death endured far beyond its century. In fact, many of the same approaches were revived during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdowns, isolation, travel restrictions, contact tracing, all echoing decisions made hundreds of years ago. Even the debates we've had in recent years between preserving economies and protecting lives mirror conversations once held by medieval leaders deciding whether to close markets or city gates. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Black Death lies in how it reshaped our understanding of disaster itself. Medieval Europeans lived in a world shadowed by uncertainty, famine, war, smaller outbreaks of disease. But nothing had prepared them for the sheer scale and speed of the plague. What followed was not just a physical reckoning, but a psychological one. Communities that made it through came away changed. They had endured losses previously unimaginable and learned that even in the face of devastation, life continued. Individuals discovered wells of resilience they never knew existed. Societies began to carry memory forward, not just pain, but strategies, rituals, and systems that would be drawn upon again and again. This ability to adapt, to survive, learn, and rebuild has remained one of humanity's greatest strengths. Time and again throughout history, we've seen this pattern repeat. After Pompeii, after Lisbon's earthquake in 1755, after the 1918 flu, tsunamis, hurricanes, and wars, people mourn, they rebuild, they honor what's lost while reimagining what can be. The Black Death, perhaps the most extreme example of such a catastrophe, revealed something profound about us: our capacity to endure and evolve. Of course, none of this diminishes the scale of suffering. The plague stole millions of lives, each with a story, a voice, a future. It tore through families and communities, silencing knowledge, erasing lineages. No societal gain or genetic advantage can ever balance that loss. And yet, by understanding how people endured, we gain insight into our own capacity to face the challenges ahead. Climate change, new diseases, social upheaval. The Black Death reminds us we are not the first to face what seems insurmountable, and we will not be the last. For the people whose stories we followed, Thomas the Plowman, Elizabeth Hancock, the villagers of Eam, none of this broader legacy would have mattered in the moment. They weren't thinking about the future of feudalism or genetic resistance. They were doing what needed to be done to get through the day. And yet, together, their small acts of courage, of adaptation, of endurance became the tide that reshaped a continent. This is how history often works, not through grand declarations, but through countless individual decisions made in quiet desperation or steady hope. Through mothers teaching children to read, through farmers claiming new fields, through neighbors choosing to stay behind to protect others. So what can we take from this long night of stories? Perhaps the simplest truth of all: human resilience, the ability to endure when all seems lost, the power to rebuild from the wreckage, to carry grief without letting it crush us, to find possibility where there was only devastation. The plague brought a kind of enforced reckoning, an invitation, however brutal, to reimagine the world. Those who survived discovered that the structures they thought immutable were, in fact, fragile, that hierarchies could fall, that roles could shift, that life, however short and fragile, could still be shaped with purpose. It also reminded us of our place in the natural world. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, so small, so ancient, reshaped human history, genetics, economics, and culture, just as other microbes have done and will do again. We are not separate from the invisible web of life around us. We are part of it, dependent on it, vulnerable to it. Finally, the plague brought death into focus. It was no longer a distant fear. It was present in every village lane, every church bell, every empty chair. For those who survived, this sharpened awareness often led to a renewed appreciation for life. Not a morbid obsession with death, but a clarity that made every sunrise feel significant. As our story draws to a close, picture once again that small medieval village, now a generation after the plague has passed. Children play in the fields. New families fill homes once empty. The elders, those who remember, tell stories of sorrow and survival, of a world that ended and another that began. They couldn't have known their lives would echo across centuries. They couldn't have imagined medical science, antibiotics, gene editing, or artificial intelligence. But they lived through their own apocalypse and found a way forward. So sleep now, comforted by the knowledge that you are part of a long human continuum, that the strength you carry is not new. It has been passed down, refined by trials like these, that you, like those before you, will meet your own challenges and adapt in ways unseen and extraordinary. And when the world seems uncertain, remember, humanity has been here before, and we are still here.